Good evening. I will speak in English now because the lecture is also going to be in English tonight. I'm very glad to welcome Professor Hu Siao-chen, professor at the Academy of Sciences in Taipei and director of the Institute of Philosophy, Chinese Literature and Philosophy at Academia Sinica. Professor Hu has published a book on the subject of the lecture tonight, which, as you will see soon during the lecture itself, is about a certain genre of literature that developed during the 19th century in Qing, late Qing dynasty China. It was women's literature, and as we will see in greater detail later, of course, the social life of women was a particular life. The social circumstances of that kind of literature were also particular, and the thing that women had no public in late Qing China, of course, was to a certain degree in disaccord with the fact that literature during that age became more and more public in general. So I have also mentioned in the essay I brought into the calendar, into the catalog, that official texts in China have not been printed until the beginning of the 19th century, but they were written by hand copies. Only in the first part of the 19th century also official texts were printed, but at the same time printing industry and printing culture already had developed quite far. Novels had been a popular genre, there has been a market for novels, a broad market for novels in Qing China and already under the Ming Dynasty. That was, of course, supported by printing culture and printing industry, but it had no official recognition in the sense of being recognized as an official genre of literature. And it was even more extreme in the case of what we now, from nowadays point of view, see as women's literature, because this kind of literature had no public, as far as I understand, at all, in the broader sense, and many of the novels and works Professor Hu is going to talk about subsequently have been or were printed only after the death of the authors. So all in all, the issue we are going to hear about and learn about more today is very much related also to the development of or to the relation of public and literary life in late imperial China, which is at the same time also early modern China, which is a period in Chinese history that is interesting because it is the period when traditional Chinese culture, or what we conceive of as traditional Chinese culture today, slowly opened up, we can say, to the world, when it came closer to certain developments that are part of what we understand as modernity today. In that sense, I wish you an interesting lecture now, and I would like to invite Professor Hu to start with her lecture here. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Before I start, I have two things to say. First, On behalf of all who are present, congratulations to the two national libraries for your success in jointly organizing the wonderful exhibition. And second, I would like to say thank you again for inviting and giving me the opportunity to stand here to share with you some of my ideas. My gratitude also goes to His Excellency, his family, and his office for all the wonderful and generous arrangements. Okay, so without further ado, I will start my talk today. Today, I'm going to talk about the making of verse narrative texts by Chinese women of the Qin dynasty, which is a period extended from the latter part of the 17th century to the first decade of the 20th century. Apparently, I should define verse narrative and explain why I use the verb make instead of write before I begin any discussion. Firstly, let me explain the usage of the verb make. I say the making of texts because it is a case that cannot be fully understood without we considering the often intertwined processes of reading, writing, hand copying, commenting on, responding to, exchanging, editing, and publishing. And the final result is therefore a product of a series of makings. As for verse narrative, I am referring to a subgenre of Chinese fiction called 弹词小说, literally plucking rhyme narrative. This is a notion I will come back to it shortly. In China, the association of literature and femininity is a relatively recent way of thinking. Just as any other culture, until very recently, Chinese literary history has been the congregation of male authors, readers, and critics, whereas women intermittently made some supplements or were seen as the source of inspiration. But we think differently now. As we reflect on the writing of literary history, we understand it to be not just a record of facts, but a construction determined by discursive powers. Consequently, it is not only impossible, but also valid to rewrite literary histories that encompass authors, works, and other literary phenomena that used to be excluded for reasons related to class, race, gender, and taste. In short, it is what we know as the reconsideration of canonicity. In the case of, now, in the context of Chinese literature, one of the most important reassessments is the delineation of women's involvement in literary activities in the Jiangnan, that is, south of Yangtze River region, during the Ming-Qing times. Educated women played the roles of readers, critics, authors, transmitters, and even publishers of literary works. Once we take their accomplishments into consideration, our understanding of Chinese literature will be significantly modified or even altered. In other words, women's literary works are not just supplement to mainstream literature. Instead, they are an integral and significant part of the Chinese literary past. As the Ming-Qing extended from the 14th to the early 20th century, it is imperative for us to pay attention to the changes and developments as time passed. The changes were responsive to political and social realities and also interacted with intellectual paradigms. Still, there are historical factors common to the whole period. For example, the exuberant economy of the Jiangnan region was a prerequisite for the emergence of women's literary activities. Urbanizations and commercialization also helped to ignite the desire for artistic pursuit. For one thing, when the economy was booming, education spread more easily. The genteel families and even the more well-off merchant families began to invest in their daughters' education, while male literati not only accepted but encouraged it. Among the elite families, young women's literary and artistic training were deemed as a plus for their opportunities to marry well, and often represented the cultural heritage that a bride brought from her natal home to her husband's home. And second, along with the economic boom, the publishing industry and the book market also grew rapidly. In the late Ming Dynasty, the quantity of books published by commercial publishing houses rose to a high level, while prices dropped accordingly, resulting in a new reading public that included less privileged groups of people. These people, such as unsuccessful scholars, merchants, and women, who had not had the opportunity to possess own books, became consumers of less expensive publications. In the case of women, some affluent genteel families that owned private publishing houses published family women's poetry collections in order to preserve family cultural heritage and elevate family status. Though not many copies of these family editions were printed, some women's works did get circulated, transmitted, and come down to us. The commercial publishing houses that flourished went in two directions. Some published highly refined books to the literati taste for the purpose of appreciation and collection, those just like you have seen today. And others published popular works that aimed to sell and make profit. The general picture of talented women was common to the late Ming and Qing dynasties. And after the dynastic transition from Ming to Qing, the Jiangnan region revived and women's education and literary activities continued. Of course, new things happened in the Qing dynasty. For me, for example, the reading, writing, and publication of narrative in verse that targeted at women readers were much more apparent in the Qing dynasty, and that will be our main focus today. So let's get to the topic of women and fiction. Previous Chinese literary histories never addressed the problem of women-authored fiction. But putting aside the many differences of definition, we note the fact that women authors of different societies indeed had a preference for narrative, stories, plots, and they contributed to the development of fiction. As Virginia Woolf said in her article, Women and Fiction, for the middle-class English women of the 19th century, fiction was a female form. But in the context of Chinese literature, when women wrote narratives, they chose to use the genre of 谈词, that is, the verse narrative, or the plucking rhyme narrative. Very few women wrote fictions in vernacular prose before the very late 19th century. On the other hand, we know at least a dozen women authors of verse narrative in the Qin dynasty. And this is a number that should not have been overlooked for such a long time. Now, let us first take a look at tanci as a form of performance. It was a song and spoken performance popular in the Jiangnan region during the Ming and Qing times and is still enjoyed today. The performer or performers tell a story with the accompaniment of string instruments. Usually, they alternate between the narration part, which is in vernacular form, vernacular prose, and the singing part, which is in rhymed verse. Let us watch two video clips in order to show you how it is going. Okay, the first is a conversation between a maid and her mistress. The maid reports to her mistress that her fiancé has just come back, while the mistress is so confused and she gets crossed. How do I? Okay, now, right. This is the first clip. This is the maid speaking. She says, "Congratulations." And she starts to sing. This is the singing part. This is the narration part. Okay, this is the first one. Now let's look at the second one. The second is adapted from a classical folklore about a girl who disguises herself as a man and goes to war. It's 木兰辞 in Chinese. Wait. Okay. Okay, so as you can see and hear, both the dramatic effect and the music are very appealing. During the Mingqing times, tanci performance was performed in a market by male performers. But private households also invited professional women performers to entertain the female family members. So it is not hard to imagine how women were attracted to it, and some even decided to try their own hands in writing their stories. Verse narrative in a written form was thus derived from the oral performance and often accentuates the verse part instead of the narration part. Apart from its language, verse narrative are similar to vernacular fiction. However, it is believed that the tanci performance has a feminine flavor. It is often slow-paced, soft, graceful, elegant, and its description is very detailed. A story, if sung by a tanci performer, could last for days. There is a joke about the slow pace of a tanci performance. It says that it took a professional performer a whole day just to describe how a maiden comes downstairs from the second floor. Because every lotus step deserves some description. This stylistic characteristic is seen in many verse narratives in the written form too. When women chose verse narrative over vernacular prose fiction, there were reasons. For one thing, tanci performance was welcomed by women. If I were them, I would think that if I used the form of verse narrative, I could attract more women readers who also loved tanci performance. And more importantly, men paid less attention to women's verse narrative than their poetry. As a result, women could express themselves with the least sense of moral censorship. I want to raise several qualities shared by women's verse narratives. First, women's verse narratives reveal an autobiographical impulse. Second, they deal with details and daily life. Third, they also like grand topics of national scale. And fourth, there is expression of unusual emotions. And fifth, there is the perpetual question of resistance or conformity on the part of the women. In the following, I will give you some interesting examples of women's verse narrative and hope you can discern the features of their writing. Historical writing has always been prestigious in Chinese tradition. The telling of one's personal history is also given importance. Speaking of biographies, we tend to think they should be faithful records of actual events, but that is never the case. Just like we cannot draw a map of the same size of a place, we cannot record a life with all its happenings of every second. A biography or autobiography is ontological in the sense that it has a message to deliver, a purpose to achieve, an image to formulate. So in order to do so, one must remember and speak from a particular perspective. A biography, therefore, is the reorganization of selected and even screened fragments of memories. And also, what lives are worth recording and remembering? Standards may vary at different times in different places. In short, instead of a faithful record, a biography is determined by many different sets of values. So let's ask, who were the women in traditional Chinese societies whose lives were found worthy of recording? Were women able to play the role of the recorder, that is, the historian? If not an empress, not an enchantress who destroyed the kingdom, would the woman have the opportunity to enter history? Previously, we are told that only chaste widows and female martyrs are included in local gazetteers and histories. They were recorded because they met the same moral standard. Do we have other resources to rely on to understand Chinese women and their lives? How did women understand themselves, and did they try to represent their own life? Verse narratives by women serve as a key to these questions. Female-authored verse narratives are often self-referential. I refer to a particular convention in verse narrative that I call self-referential passages. These are parallel-text arranged to appear at the beginning or end of chapters. We know that the Chinese vernacular fiction uses the format of professional storytelling, and the narrator addresses the reader directly at the beginning and end of each chapter, and saying set phrases such as, "Dear reader, if you want to know more, please come back tomorrow," or "Please wait for the next chapter." In the verse narrative, women authors also borrowed from the storytelling tradition, yet they invented new usages. In professional storytelling, in order to set the tone and prepare the audience, the narrator would tell a short story before the main story, and it is called the frame story. Women authors of verse narrative followed the format by inserting passages unrelated to the main plot at the beginning or end of chapters. And these passages are reserved for the author's self-expression. The author speaks to the reader about the season, the climate, the mood she is in, her family background, her relationship with family members, her motive of writing, and so on. So if we string together these self-referential passages, we will get a picture of the author's life and her writing process. Therefore, the insertion of self-referential passages is an alternative form of autobiography. Let us look at 2 examples. The first example is from the most famous masterpiece of verse narrative, that is, 在生缘, Karmic Bound in Reincarnation. The work is about a heroine who disguises herself as a man, has a successful political career, and experiences psychological dilemma and trauma when confronting the pressure to reveal her true female identity. It was written by a genteel woman called Chen Duansheng. Her writing the verse narrative is itself a great story. She started writing Karmic Bound when she was a very young girl. As told in one of her self-referential passages, after reading a verse narrative called Karmic Bound of the Jade Bracelet, another work, allegedly co-authored by a mother and a daughter, Chen Duansheng became dissatisfied with its ending and decided to correct it by writing a new work to continue the story. The writing progressed smoothly. Also, according to her self-referential passages that go with the writing, she wrote more than 500,000 characters within 1.5 years. It is because she was born in an elite family, and as an unmarried daughter, she had few household chores to attend to. Later, the writing stopped because she began to encounter changes in life. Her mother and sister died, she got married, and soon she became a mother. She did not resume writing until a personal tragedy took place. Her husband was exiled for an unspeakable reason, and it is believed to be a fraud in the imperial examination. And the happy young mother was suddenly thrown into an abyss. And in the darkest moment of her life, Chen Duansheng picked up the book project after a long pause of 14 years. Unfortunately, she didn't live to finish the book. She left it unfinished at the climax, when the heroine faces the last straw to press her to reveal identity. As there is little information about her in historical records, we know about her through the details given in the self-referential passages. So let us take a look at this paragraph, as you can see on the screen. She says, I scratch my head in perplexity, crying out for heaven. I want to question heaven. I ask heaven if the ways of heaven can be restored. I have tasted all the bitterness in the world, and I can recall only the innocent years of my childhood. We sisters shared the same bed, and together we listened to the rain at night. Father and mother gave us different rhymes and taught us to write poetry. Our residence was located near the Eastern Sea, and the tide came close. I felt as if I were living on a magic mountain, as happy as an immortal. I accompanied my father on his official trips and grew up in the course of the journey. I was fortunate enough to receive my parents' affection. How dared I pursue a writing career? Still, I began writing Karmic Bound for fun. My mother was pleased with it and often corrected me here and there. So the stupid girl became more fond of narrating her dream. After my mother passed away, I gave up the brush. Our returning boat was delayed, so I reopened my old manuscript, and in my chamber at leisure, I resumed writing the story. For some time I had Buddhist insights, but I got married and trapped by worldly affairs. Fortunately, my parents-in-law have pity on me, and the most gratifying thing is that my husband is a scholar. I used to trim the lamp and accompany him in reading while the tea was bubbling and boiling. We marked the candle to measure the time when composing poems and joined in laughter. We were unified and harmonious couple, and we already had a precious pearl, that is, a daughter. The sun stopped, the stream broke, the mirror was broken and could not be repaired. The wild goose lost its mate alone beyond the setting sun, and the sorrowful traveler found himself at the ultimate frontier. While her life turned unfortunate, she began to remember the happiest days of her life, that is, her childhood, when she studied and practiced composing poetry with sisters under the instruction of parents. In such a privileged family environment, she started writing comic bound in reincarnation in a carefree spirit. The writing was not a secret, it was not forbidden. She shared her work with her mother and received feedback. She lost interest when her mother, that is her ideal reader, died. And though she temporarily resumed writing, she had to give up again because of the so-called worldly burden, worldly affairs she bore as a married woman. She was fortunate enough to have good husband and parents-in-law, but the marital felicity was cut short by the failed pursuit for fame and profit, presumably on the part of her husband. While she sat hopelessly at home, she managed to bear hardships only with the comfort of writing. This passage is autobiographical. Readers learn about her life, the tragedy of her family, her emotion, and her motive of writing. As the narrative is a vehicle for artistic expression, the self-referential insertion is the channel for the author's autobiographical impulse. There is a more extreme case of autobiographical expression in the verse narrative Bi Sheng Hua, flowers generated from the brush. It was written by a 19th century woman named Qiu Xinru. Its plot is somewhat similar to Chen Duansheng's Karmic Bond, but in a more moralized tone. In spite of the author's open announcement to be morally impeccable, the author had such a strong autobiographical impulse that she tried to insert as many details as possible into the self-referential passages. Her self-referential passages, therefore, read like a diary, with details of daily life and private thoughts. While a married woman, poet, as a rule, speaks as a good, sensible wife and mother, the author's voice in the verse narrative has less concern for womanly decorum or propriety. It is a genre that is more tolerant to women's tears, giggles, complaints, and angers. Qiu Xinru, for example, often complained about the incapability of her husband, the meanness of her in-laws, and the stupidity and laziness of her son. Reading her imaginary work, the reader is also taking a peek at her private life. Pre-modern women regarded their writings as the extension of their bodies and sometimes took the extreme action of burning all their manuscripts on their deathbed in order to protect their integrity and chastity. Considering this, we find Qiu Xinru's writing very audacious, in the sense that she deliberately exposed her personal life and her innermost feelings, which are morally questionable to her readers, who she knew were people outside her family circle. Unlike Chen Duansheng, Qiu Xinru was not born in a family of high prestige. Her father was only a low-ranking official, and she was married to an unaccomplished scholar. Looking back at her carefree childhood, Qiu Xinru had nothing but complaints about her married life, as she said here. she says. Ever since I got married, I have been held down by worldly burdens. Managing the household takes time and effort. My mind is preoccupied. My hands are busy. I am absorbed by wifely duties and am anxious every day. Where can I find the extra mood for literary pursuits? What I am left with is oil, salt, sauce, and vinegar. They interfere with my poetic inspiration. Recently, my younger sister came home with her parents-in-law. She showed me her newly composed lyrics, and my interest was aroused. Only then did I take out my old manuscript and, lighting up the lamp, spread out the paper, trying to continue the story. I used the extra time between the busy hours to finish this chapter. It is hardly noticeable that since I stopped, 19 long years have passed. We may also want to look at this paragraph, which says, "It has been 21 years since I was married, during which I have never had any good luck. All I have is misfortune. I have tasted all the bitterness of the world. Now and then I listen to harsh criticism from my parents-in-law. What makes me happy is that my beloved daughter is capable. I am somewhat consoled. What brings me regret is that my stupid son quit school, shame on his mother. What worries me is that my husband is all the year round driven by hunger. And what depressed me is that my widowed sister lost her home, but still persists in widowhood. One after one, these things have already weighed my heart down, and I am constantly sad. Moreover, in these days, I have been bothered by illness. All day, all alone, I know, even a dilapidated room could shelter me. But how can I bear the hardship? The oven is cold, the kitchen is deserted. I almost have to give up cooking. Really, fallen leaves take the place of firewood is not an exaggeration. Really, to have wild vegetables to eat is hardly sufficient." This self-referential passage reveals details of her personal life. What perplexes us is how she honestly, or even exaggeratedly, represented the dark side of her family. In another passage, she said that, "My mind is disturbed as I hate my son's stupidity when he keeps asking me characters. Smart and capable, my daughter offers help, and I rely on her ability. While it is a cloudy day today, therefore unsuitable for needlework, I take some leisure to finish this chapter, but tomorrow shall be reserved for needlework." We almost can imagine her saying to her son, "Go away, don't come bother me. Can't you see that I'm trying to write here?" And she liked her daughter more because she could lend a hand and gave her time to write. I seriously doubt how many 19th century mothers dared to give themselves an irresponsible image like this. But I think our author did it intentionally. Rather than giving the image of an irresponsible mother, she was trying to construct the image of a dedicated author, a writer. It is the image of the writer, not that of the wife, mother, and daughter-in-law, that would make her life meaningful. She was also asking for her female readers' empathy, compassion, as those readers might also want something other than wifely duties to devote themselves to. Okay, next I want to bring your attention to the representation of unorthodox ideas and characters in women's verse narratives of the Qin dynasty. Our first example is a work called Yu Lian Huan, Linked Rings of Jade, by a woman author named Zhu Su-xian. She was also the only woman author of verse narrative who did not maintain that she was a well-educated lady of the genteel class. I will not give you a synopsis of the plot, but will discuss a particular aspect of this text, that is, its portrayal of unorthodox female figures. One of the characteristics of women's 谈词 is the exaltation of the female sex. We often encounter morally perfect and intellectually superior heroines. But in Linked Rings, we encounter female figures that do not conform to social morally orthodox values. I will first focus on a mother figure with a drinking problem in Linked Rings. And to my knowledge, she is the only female alcoholic character in all women's 谈词. Reading Linked Rings is a fresh experience because unlike other verse narratives by women, it is short of ornate diction and sometimes appears vulgar in its language. However, its language flows smoothly between the refined and the colloquial, thus delivering an easy and lively quality. And the dialogue and singing passages are engaging and witty, achieving an effect more like that in a real oral performance. It also differs from other women's 谈词 in that it deals with the life of common people rather than the royal house or the nobles. More strikingly, it seems to uphold an unorthodox set of moral principles. This drunken lady is called Madame Liang, Liang 夫人. She is over 60 years old, a mother of 5 children, and obsessed with drinking, joking, and teasing people. She hardly has any feminine charm. She willingly presents herself as an alcoholic from the moment she makes her appearance in a text, and then announces a theory of the necessity for women to get drunk often. She tells the audience that she indulges herself in reading and drinking in order to achieve domestic harmony. As she says, "A cup in hand is most gratifying, making me put aside all trouble. When I am drunk, I doze off, no time for quarrels. Before I learned the art of drinking, I often clashed with my husband. When we argued, I toppled the stool and shattered the pot. And in no time, we yelled at each other from this end of the room to the other. But after I learned the lovely secret of drinking, no business is my business, as I get drunk every morning." Madame Liang postures as a shrew. When she is annoyed, she knocks over the stool and smashes the pot. Later on in the chapter, she mentions that if her husband dares to disagree with her on their daughter's marriage arrangement, she will surely tear his red robe into pieces and hit him on the head until his official's cap falls off. Though she is a character in a narrative, Madame Liang has a powerful stage presence with a voice and a bearing that display her as an incorrigible alcoholic. But doesn't her choice resemble that of many Chinese scholars in the literary tradition who find comfort and solace in alcohol when they are ensnared in personal hardships or political turmoil? The image of the shrew in Linked Rings also deserves attention. In literary representation, the mad woman has the potential to be a powerful character. as she can produce strong narrative and dramatic effects, and is easily endowed with moral and symbolic significance. The image of the shoe can be either comic or dreadful, depending on how the author portrays her in the text. Interestingly, scholars often believe jealous and shrewish wives are the creation of male authors only. Women's verse narrative show this is far from true. In women's verse narrative, images of the spoiled daughter, the licentious woman, the shrewish wife, and the mad woman are often intertwined. In general, there are women who refuse to conform to orthodox norms. Madame Liang is certainly one of them. Her intoxication gives her an excuse to have things her own way. Her madness is more like a show, and her foolish image and raving language hint at an alternative truth centering on the authenticity of feelings, in contrast to the mundane values represented by her corrupted husband. Madame Liang is particularly shrewish when she gets drunk. When she argues with her husband over their daughter's marriage, she is even physically violent, as we see here. You come here. Oh, Madame, here I am. You just contradicted me. Oh, Madame, please let go, please. This is her husband saying. Be merciful and let go of me. You have pulled out all my whiskers except for a few. My Madame roars like a lioness. She frightens me so much that I almost wet my pants in terror. Violent as she is, Madame Liang is still comic. Her shrewish behavior is meant to bring out laughter rather than fear. We know to be a heroine requires extraordinary qualities besides beauty and talent. The heroine's characteristics take her to the edge of a cliff. One more step forward, and she will run the risk of truly subverting social order. While the unorthodox female figures in women's verse narrative may not be the heroines of the stories, they often act as doubles of the heroine and become an important part of the narrative. They are significant in that they enrich the text and complicate the image of the heroine. Our next example is Liu Hua Meng, or Dream of the pomegranate flowers. As you see on the screen, it is a very, as you see here, it is a very voluminous text. It's a saga of several aristocratic families. It is believed to be the longest Chinese narrative ever. It is also one of only a handful of women's verse narratives that deal seriously with warfare. But it is also a work that attempts to look into the depths of love. Love goes so deep that the essence of a human being, that is, blood, best defines and expresses it. In terms of love, blood works in this work as tears do in the story of the stone. Love is therefore seen as being as violent as war, and war is represented as being as fantastic as love. According to the preface, the author was originally from Gansu, which is the western and northern part of China. She married someone from Hunan, which is the southwestern part of China, and she finally settled down in the Fujian region, which is in the southern part of China. The work was never printed during the Qin dynasty, but records show it was well received by women readers who transcribed, hand-copied, and circulated the manuscript. Some say young women would take a transcribed copy of the book as part of their dowries. In the narrative, there is a relationship that is emotionally perplexing and entangling. It is the love between the leading heroine called Gui Hengkui. This is the number one heroine, and her sworn sister Gui Henchao. This is the number two heroine. And their relationship is with so many battles and wars as their background. And their love is tried and proven by tears, flesh, blood, and finally, life itself. The two women meet each other, disguise themselves as brothers, and change their names to Gui Hengkui and Gui Henchao to show that they are brothers. And later, when the dynasty is threatened by foreign invasion, they volunteer to lead troops to defend China. For more than 8 years, they fight side by side at the frontier, developing close relationships that are, however, fraught with tension that will plague them for the rest of their lives. To start with, there are multiple possibilities in the relationship between these two heroines. First, there are sworn sisters who are engaged to the same man. So they call their friendship golden orchid, which is a term customarily reserved for sisterhood. Secondly, as they both are cross-dressed, disguised as men, they are known as brothers. Publicly and privately, they habitually call each other my brother. And lastly, their emotional attachment to each other is strong enough to be called love, and they often act as a married couple. Throughout the work, the first heroine described the second heroine as the most feeling person of all ages. And the first heroine describes herself as the most unfeeling unfeeling person of all ages. When she speaks of herself as unfeeling, she always refers to her detachment from heterosexual love and reluctance to marry as wife. And the second heroine's feeling is often represented by the overflowing of bodily fluids, most notably tears and blood. Throughout, when people comment on the second heroine's personality, they find her particularly charming because of her fullness of feeling, worries, illness, and tears. Okay? So even when she fights heroically on the battlefield, she often looks into the distance, shedding tears and thinking of the person she cares about. And on the other hand, she shows so much reserve as if she is short of feeling. Because of the time limitation, I think I will just show you some paragraphs from this text in order for you to understand how strong the mutual feelings between them is. Let's look at this one. It says, well, it is when the first heroine, number one heroine, is severely injured in one of the battles, and she is dying. So the second heroine nearly dies of grief too, as described here. It was as if her heart was split open by a flying knife. Her blood gushed out in an upsurge, pouring freely from her mouth. While she was still murmuring, "My brother," she was too weak to hold her delicate body and collapsed on the bed. Her consciousness was dispersed, as could be seen on her face. Her 3 souls floating away had already gone out of her mind. How pitiable! This feeling woman who valued friendship lost her life after pouring out torrents of blood. During their lifetime, the 2 sisters loved each other like a couple. Till death, they kept each other company and went together to the gate of the dead. And of course, they didn't actually die. They both survived. And more than 20 years later, when the first heroine finally dies of an inexplicable disease, which actually is an excuse for her to ascend to the celestial realm, the second heroine tries to commit suicide by cutting her own throat, as described here. While the blade hit as swiftly as the wind, fresh blood burst out like the outpouring tide. The ladies-in-waiting laid her in bed, but her soul was already dispersed. The most passionate person of all ages was thus gone forever. 10,000 strings of love were entangled inside her as she repaid her dear friend with all the burning blood in her bosom. Well, she recovered again. But after she recovers from this serious wound, the old illness of spitting up blood recurs, and half a year later, the second heroine is still determined to end her own life. And she writes a letter to her husband in which she says that the only word one cannot forget is Cjin. In Chinese, it means feeling, emotion, or love. And that she is ready to splash her blood by jumping out from a tower. And as she prepares to leap, the narrator comments, all the burning blood from her bosom splashed against her face. She thereby sustained her fragrant reputation, all for the sake of Cjin. In the narrative, the heroine's chronic illness is called 血症, or the disease of spitting blood, the disease of blood. It is interesting to note that long after she returns from the war against the invaders, the narrator still refers to her as the woman commander. Indeed, she is a commander in love as much as in war. In fact, she shed more blood on the battlefield of love than on the battlefield of war. Okay, in the following, I will show you some paragraphs that describe the essential corporal attachment to each other. Because these paragraphs are quite long, I will not read. As you may see from the screen, you can read on your own. These paragraphs are actually quite explicit of same-sex love and physical attraction to each other. Right? See, a lot of touching, stroking, caressing, closing doors, sending away the maids, and so on. Okay, so it's not implicit, it's quite explicit. Okay, so with so much emotion and physical attraction, the relationship becomes a topic of gossip in the narrative. Okay, so we may want to ask, why does it have to be so explicit? Why is this same-sex love so explicitly described in the work? Though it may be a little bit far-fetched, I think a little speculation is necessary here. Throughout the work, the term golden orchid is repeatedly used to refer to intimate relationship between women. Granted that the term is generally applied to sworn brotherhood or sisterhood or friendship, the high frequency of its appearance in the text is still eye-catching. We know that golden orchid is also a term widely used in areas noted for strong sisterhood, for example, Guangdong and Fujian. In some parts of Hunan, too, where the women's scripts and women's singing customs were discovered, the same term again describes strong bonds between women. So the author spends time in the Hunan and Fujian areas for many years. So it is very possible that the idea of sisterhood had a great impact on the author. However, this is not homosexuality or lesbianism as we understand it today. The modern terms may not apply. I think this is a thesis that deserves more exploration, which is a very interesting topic for people who get interested today. Before I end my talk, I want to briefly mention a verse narrative called 子虚记, story of fiction, very metaphorical, story of fiction. It's by a late 19th century genteel woman called Wang Shang. Oh, okay, all right. Her manuscript was kept by her daughter's family for more than 100 years before it was donated to the government. During the Cultural Revolution, her great-great-granddaughter actually ran the risk of her life, losing her life, to protect the many volumes of the manuscript. And she took the manuscript with her to travel to all the places she was sent to. Okay, so this is a very beautiful story, just as His Excellency has told us today that during the Cultural Revolution, so much of the Chinese heritage was destroyed. But this is one of the rare cases when a woman was willing to run the risk of her own life just to protect their family heritage. So this is truly a living evidence of verse narrative by women considered to be a part of the family cultural heritage. Okay, the author, Wang Shang, as you can see, the work is very long. It has dozens of volumes as a manuscript. The author wrote the work in response to earlier verse narratives that deal with female characters that disguise as males and pursue political careers. As we read from the author's announcement, okay, it says, tonight, in the voice of the heroine of the text, tonight I change my clothes and leave home. It is out of the question for me to be a woman again. Madame Yan, the stepmother, is wicked, but her evils are vainly, as they turn out to help a woman achieve fame. In exaltation, I become a man. I will be a minister of illustriousness and brilliance. If one day the secret is revealed, I will return to blissful, pure land. Okay. I'm sorry. Apparently the screen does not show the rest of the passage, but basically she is saying that if my true identity as a female is revealed, I will ascend to heaven, which is a euphemism for committing suicide. So her heroine vows to die rather than giving up public careers. Considering the author was writing after the Taiping Civil War in the latter part of the 19th century, in national turmoil, we are led to consider female heroism in a new light, heading toward the coming of the modern age. Okay, so from the examples above, I hope that I have shown the diversity of women's verse narrative in terms of topics and style. The making of women's verse narrative involved not only women writers, but readers and other parties of the book market. It is a genre that awaits further studies and exploration. Thank you for listening, and your comment will be most welcome. Thank you.